This is Ashley Newby, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, cultural workers, political organizers, and everyone in between in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Stacie McCormick, Associate Professor of English and Chair of Comparative Race and Ethnic Studies and Women and Gender Studies at Texas Christian University. Her work takes up a number of subjects such as Black body politics, land, sexuality, and the ongoing resonance of slavery in contemporary Black writing and performance. She is the author of Staging Fugitivity and co-editor of the special issue of College Literature entitled Toni Morrison: An Adaptation. Her forthcoming book, entitled We Are Pregnant with Freedom: Black Feminist Storytelling for Reproductive Justice, focuses on Black critical engagement with gynecological and obstetric medicine through storytelling. Hello, Dr. McCormick. Thank you so much for being with us today. How are you?
I am good. Thank you so much for having me.
No problem at all. We're happy to have you. So we can dive right in. How did you get into Black studies and what keeps you committed to the field?
Oh, yes. How did I get into Black studies? I think about that question like from the movie, I think it's Brown Sugar. How did you fall in love with hip hop, right? How did I get into Black studies? So in some ways, I feel like so much of my life is Black studies. I am from Mississippi, a small town right in the center of the state. And I was living in the shadow of so much history. James Meredith, who integrated the University of Mississippi, is from my hometown. My mom actually integrated her elementary school. I grew up just a couple of cities over from where Fannie Lou Hamer did her work in Ruralville, Mississippi, as well as where Emmett Till was lynched. And so there's this way that I feel like Black studies has always been a part of me. And so, as someone who kind of came of age in the 80s, I think for many of us, our parents were determined and our community was determined to teach us our history because they know that those histories weren't being taught in our schools. And so, because we weren't represented in our histories in schooling, much of our education would happen in these communal sites like the Black church.
Mhm.
Some of the first places where I was introduced to Black literary individuals, people who were doing civil rights or activist work. The first place I learned about Ida B. Wells was through our church's Black History plays. And I can't say how much that kind of created within me a sense of connectedness to the histories and cultures and the contributions of Black people to the world. So when I think about that foundation, I feel like it was inevitable that I was going to go on to study and do Black studies. So one of the, I would say, threshold moments, though, for me was being given a book by one of my friends. She was reading a book called Jubilee by Margaret Walker Alexander. And I was in the 7th grade. And I said, oh my God, what is this big old book you're reading that you can't put down? And so she told me she had checked it out of the library. One of our teachers had given it to her and told her it was a good book to read. And she loved it. So I was like, okay, I'm going to take this recommendation. I'm going to read this book too, because I wanted to conquer that mountain of this big book. I can't tell you how much that book shaped and changed me. Margaret Walker Alexander, a Mississippi writer and a major figure within the state, alongside Richard Wright, wrote this beautiful opus, if you will, that spoke to Black folks' history from slavery and the ways that generational impact continued. So it was my first introduction to that subject matter, and I really never looked back. So every time I had the option to choose what I could do for an assignment, I chose a Black person. So I remember when I had to do a performance of a poet. And I had to record myself and play it for the class. And I chose the poem "We Wear the Mask." And I had the African drums playing, and I picked up on some of those church traditions, and I recited that poem. And that was what I would say was like my foundation. Now, going into college, I was a first generation college student, so I didn't really know much about the possibilities for making that a career. I didn't know that I could go and get a PhD focusing on Black studies. So eventually I found my way through majoring in education and English literature, and eventually getting to focus on African American and African diaspora literature. So that is where I kind of made my way into formalizing this informal relationship that I've had to Black studies as a field.
Thank you. It's always interesting to hear how people come to the field. And I think, obviously the connection of the church to Black studies and to Black people
Yeah.
is one that definitely has made a lasting impact and continues to come up. Like a lot of people, if you were raised in a Black church, that was your introduction to a lot of this information and a lot of the people that you probably wouldn't hear about otherwise.
That's right. That's right. And I think that when I think about the critical role Black churches play in all kinds of level of liberatory, work for all of the Black churches' complications, one of the things that I know, is just a staple is that it provided a communal space for Black people to be seen,
Mhm.
Black people to engage in expressive culture in a way that was not kind of bound by the white gaze. So there was so much possibility, even beyond just the organizing work that would take place. I think about the artistic work, the communal work, all the ways that the care work, right?
Mhm.
Happen within these spaces. So I certainly credit the Black church for giving me that foundation.
Thank you.
Mm.
So, how would you situate yourself in relationship to the disciplines? So, you talked about education, you talked about English and literature, and then Black studies. So, how do you situate yourself in relationship to the different fields that you intersect with?
Yes. So I would say that one of the things I do want to kind of come back to in even thinking about the Black church, and although I was introduced to multiple Black women thinkers and writers, there was still a kind of patriarchal understanding
Mhm.
of the kind of roots of the leadership of the field and that. So really, as I studied literature, the work that resonated with me most was the Black feminist scholarship. And so from Zora Neale Hurston to Alice Walker to, Toni Morrison, looking at the ways that Black women made space for themselves in this broader expanse of Black studies. So, one of my guiding posts is June Jordan, who writes about Black studies bringing back the person, right? And so, first and foremost, when I think about where I situate myself in Black studies, it's definitely within a Black feminist context because I feel that it's so critical to bring forward the voices of Black feminists and Black women as central to so much of the intellectual work and development of Black studies. And so, in many ways, my work kind of crosses these particular terrains of Black body politics and embodiment. I would say that those anchors are where my work kind of goes back and forth in between. So, my dissertation, which looked at the Black female body in pain and representations of it, it picks up on a kind of cross genre analysis where I looked at novelists, I looked at um, playwrights, poets, and I was basically trying to get a sense of how were Black women representing the body in the mid to late 20th century and even into the contemporary. And how do we negotiate these tricky politics of Black pain and visuality while also claiming our own sentience and our own humanity and the validity of our pain?
Mhm.
And so I did that. But in order to perform that analysis, though, I had to look at history, art, literature, performance. And so there was a way that even though I was doing a dissertation that was rooted in literary study, I was definitely integrating a Black feminist methodology and framework in order to perform that work. So, um, it has now expanded in many ways to looking at those body politics through the lens of reproduction. And so my current work is very much invested in looking at Black feminist storytelling and reproductive justice and representing the politics of the body when it comes to um, obstetric medicine, experiences related to Black maternal mortality crisis, even thinking about queerness and thinking about gender non-binary connections around reproduction that often don't get discussed, but are certainly critical to those experiences. And so my work is always invested in pulling forth the voices and conversations that don't necessarily comport with this kind of singular understanding of Black culture, Black studies, and Black people. I think that one of the most important things we can do as scholars is complicating always Blackness and the ways that it shows up in the world and how we engage with this kind of really, complex but also vast site of possibility that is Blackness. So those are the ways that I find myself in the field and doing this work.
So I do want to ask a follow-up question.
Yeah.
So you're in looking at um, critical engagement with gynecological and obstetric medicine, particularly through storytelling. I wonder if you would just say a little bit more about that. We know that obviously the development of the field, the gynecological field, was done through the exploitation and torture of Black female bodies.
Yes, yes.
But I think that too often, even in the increasing recognition of the Black maternal mortality crisis, the voices of Black women are not being centered in that. Like, we can look at the numbers, but there is still a lack of um, paying attention to
Yeah.
Black women, right? And so I think the storytelling component is very interesting and important. So I wonder if you would just say a little bit more about that in the work that you're doing around it.
Yeah, that's such a great question because one of the things that attracted me to this work was looking at the stories that were coming out of this larger communication and discourse around Black maternal mortality. Um,
Mhm.
it in many ways, especially before COVID and before, kind of in the lead up to that crisis, there was, a groundswell of information around this issue. But the thing that was so remarkable to me is that Black women were not the ones who were reporting out the data, and their voices were often kind of marginalized, even in this matter that most squarely impacted them. And so I came across a piece written by two white obstetricians and researchers that gave a lot of prescriptions for solving the issue, but all of them tilted toward patient blame. So they say, well, if patients would lose more weight, if they would engage in healthier practices, not smoking and things like that, and if they would see the doctor more, right? So there are all these problems with that because we know that this is more complicated than those things.
Mhm.
you know, and medical racism is real. Just looking at those conversations, I was saying, oh wow, there needs to be more interaction of Black women and birthing people's voices in this conversation, you know. And so what is my role as a literary scholar? How can I make that intervention? And so what I did and what I took up was a kind of qualitative study, drawing on storytelling and storytelling circles with community members in my local area of Dallas, Texas. So I worked with a local organization here called the AFIA Center. And together we gathered communities of people who wanted to talk about what was happening to them in medicine. And in addition to that, so going back to your other great point about the silences, breaking those silences. So there are so many reasons for those silences. Some of it is because of the marginalization, right? Just literal not hearing from people, not wanting to talk to them and get their perspectives. And the other is from silences around all things sexuality,
Mhm.
thing, loss. And so it gets stigmatized. And Billy Avery calls it a conspiracy of silence. And I was really inspired by her charge to us to break the conspiracy of silence. And you would be surprised at how many people had come to us and said, this is the first time I've ever talked about this beyond just my own journaling or private space, a therapist. And they found so much power in knowing that their story could be told not only in that space, but that it could potentially help someone have a better experience. And so, what we were finding was that not only were we getting these stories that were happening in the hospital and in these spaces where Black women and birthing people were engaged, we were also facilitating healing. We were facilitating community building. We were bringing forth people in a way that showed them that another world was possible.
Mhm.
And that to me felt so empowering. And I have continued to do that work in an ongoing way. And, you know, as I think about the impact, another aspect of the critical import of doing this storytelling work is when you go to the hospital, they record what has happened to you, right? We think of them as medical records.
Mhm.
And those medical records contain data about your experience at the hospital. But the vantage point from which those medical records are written are from the health professionals.
Mhm.
And it's often not done in correspondence with patient voices. And I have to give credit to, scholars like Dinah Ann Davis and others, Monica McLemore, Dr. Karen Scott. With Dr. Monica McLemore, they've all been doing these really important interventions around how do we raise up patient voices and experience from the perspective of medicine and the processes, the actual collection of that medical data. And so, how do we ensure patient safety? How do we do these things? But one of the things, because I'm not trained as a clinician and I'm not trained in that way, I wanted to know what role art making and creativity and these other kinds of narrative interventions could also have as we work to restructure these systems
Mhm.
and bring forth better possibilities for Black women and birthing people. So that's in many ways the work I've been doing across these years. And it has been some of the most gratifying work that I've done because it is very much bridging the work that I do in reading narratives from, say, fiction writers. I think about a novel that I engage a lot, which is Gail Jones's Corregidora. And it is about someone who experiences a kind of loss and an inability to conceive. And that novel meditates on what it means to make generations and the central character's inability to do so. But that whole conversation can be so generative to someone who's experienced multiple levels of loss or
Mhm.
who's trying to reconcile unresolved trauma. And so when I put these literary works in conversation with the actual stories that people were experiencing on the ground, we just found this beautiful mosaic of stories that is just really generating, for me at least, and what I know many of our participants reported, which is Black sexual and reproductive liberation narratives, right? That those are critical to our own freedom. And I'll just say one other thing, and this was the thing that I really loved about the work is, you know, the slave narrative, those early texts, those were foundations for people to narrate their work toward freedom.
Mhm.
And as they disseminated that work and they raised awareness to the things that they were experiencing, then they were able to enact, along with allies and other types of individuals who were invested in abolition, they were able to shift. And so I see these stories kind of in a similar way.
Thank you. That's
Mhm.
one, it's critically important work, but it's also really indicative of the possibilities that are within Black studies and women and gender and sexuality studies, where
Eh,
you are focused on the question or the issue, and then you're bringing in the methods that are going to allow you to address this thing or answer this question that has not been properly attended to in the past.
Right, right. And that's the beauty of what I feel like a Black feminist analysis does, right?
Mhm.
That it gives us language to highlight both the racial and sexual dimensions of these issues and how they play out on the Black body. So,
Absolutely.
mm,
So, kind of building on that, I'm curious as to how your work um, as a teacher, like, how does your well, you have a background in education, so there's that. But like, how does Black studies in the work that you do, your research, influence your pedagogy and what you do in the classroom?
yes. Oh, okay. One of the things that I was helping students understand in a recent class engagement, because I teach at a predominantly white institution and I also teach in Texas. So these are interesting times that we're in. Um, but the thing that I have found to be so critical in training any scholar to do this work is to teach them the distinctions between what it means to study Black people and to do Black studies.
Mhm.
'Cause they are very different things.
Yeah.
And I think that sometimes we can have situations where people will say, well, this is Black studies, but then you look at the work and it doesn't engage Black thinkers. It doesn't upend a kind of, formalized structure that often doesn't account for Black subjectivity and often obscures it,
Mhm.
and has done harm. And so, I think that one of the charges that we as teachers in Black study have to do is that we have to upend the kind of everyday practices of academia. And it's not to say that we are necessarily trying to educate students in a way that doesn't prepare them for the next step, right? But what I know that is necessary. So, for example, one of my biggest commitments is that when I do introduce subject matter that contains Black pain and trauma, that there's a way that I condition students to be able to, or prepare them rather, to be able to engage with this work through a lens that does not objectify or even re-traumatize some of the folks in the room who are looking on to these, things.
Mhm.
So, teaching a text like Toni Morrison's Beloved, right, is very difficult when you have this kind of diverse classroom where some of the students are learning about this from in the moment
Mhm.
for the first time. Some students, because of their identities, have lived it. And so the conversations look different and a lot of things. So I create kind of ground, a shared understanding, thinking about community agreements. How are we going to be together in this space? How do we hold what we see in a way that isn't necessarily just looking at these individuals as subjects, but as these individuals as people first and their humanity? How do we speak about them in a way that upholds their humanity? And make sure that in the process that we aren't doing, some of those methods or ways of being in academia where we just kind of make everything this myth of objectivity, I guess we right? And so that's kind of always where I start. And then I remind students to make sure they're citing Black thinkers, right? There's nothing worse than seeing someone take a primary text by a Black author or a primary subject, and then you say, a non-Black thinker to dominate the majority of the analysis. And while I think a multitude of voices is valuable, when you do Black studies, you cite those Black scholars who have been doing that work, right? And they are in many ways your North Star. And so, one of the other things that grounds where I've taken my research and also how I teach my students is nothing about us without us. So we have to always include the voices of the people that we are researching with.
Yeah.
And that we need to also upend how we fashion expertise and what it sounds like and what it looks like to do scholarship and research. Because that's what Black Studies gives us. It gives us this beautiful, I think about the folks who've done such beautiful work in showing us what's possible
Yeah.
with research. And so it's my duty in the classroom to lift up that work and to make sure my students honor it as well.
Thank you. I think that that's always an important reminder, like, to, um, honor and to, acknowledge the work that has gone on before that allows the work that we engage in today to actually happen. And
Yes,
those linkages not only inform what's possible, but they allow us to dream, for alternative futures that might not have been realized yet, which is so important, particularly in these moments.
exactly. I honestly have been leaning a lot into that. How have they navigated times that were difficult and still thought about futures and possibilities? There's so many lessons in that. There's so much beauty in that. And one of my goals is to utilize those particular works and orientations to show students how they build on each other. That you don't just come to say a Ta-Nehisi Coates without James Baldwin, or we don't come to James Baldwin without, a Richard Wright, or the kind of lineages that exist for us, right? And how they're all kind of in this longer arc.
Mhm.
Thinkers.
Yeah, and I mean, just the role of lineage and, um, relation,
Yeah.
whether that be, like, chosen or blood, is so important to Black culture and Black people in general. Like, that is chosen relation as well as blood relation is so integral to how we think about the world and our place in the world anyway.
Yes, agreed, agreed. And that to me too is the beauty of, when we think about Black studies, that it's a site of coming together.
Mhm.
I think about the work I do, and one of the things that I really have been doing more of and I'm really enjoying is the collaboration. And so in literary study, I was kind of trained to do things more singularly
Mhm.
because we tended to do our analysis of the text and we wrote up what we thought and our research and what we found. And we did it often in our own little silos. But it was when I came into Black studies that I was able to see possibilities to collaborate and to do more work in community as opposed to kind of just existing on my own island. And that to me is also so critical. I think you can't do this work without community.
Mhm.
And when we think about the possibilities and relationality and how we bring people into the space and how we connect with people, that is too, methodology. That's a critical, way of doing the work that is specific to Black studies.
Absolutely.
Mm,
So, now I'm very curious to know what, uh now that we've talked about so many different aspects, um,
right.
what interests you most about the past of Black study? Both in excited and maybe critical senses.
Yes, yes. So I've been kind of lingering on this because it's connected to some of the recent research I'm doing. And it's about the kind of past around reproduction and medical experimentation, body politics and things like that. And so as I think about the field of Black studies and all the ways of like what's possible in exploring the different facets, one of the things that most excites me about that past is how have people kind of talked about this? What exists for us in the archives?
Mhm.
I have been in conversation with scholars who are doing work even on some of the activist work in Mississippi around Black women's health and public health. And, thinking about health as a discourse in Black communities and all of those complexities, right? So you have the histories of medical experimentation and exploitation from the Tuskegee experiment to the Mississippi appendectomy and all the sterilizations that happen in different parts of the country. And then you have these other dynamics of navigating health access and the phasing out of granny midwives and things like that. And so how were people navigating health? Um, and how does that inform how we see those navigations happen today? Or even what lessons can we learn to actually enact a more kind of liberatory reproductive justice orientation to public health? Because reproductive justice is not just about reproduction, right? It's about making sure that we have safe and sustainable communities for in which people can grow and thrive. And so that has really captured my imagination right now. But I always love to just getting a bigger sense of the canon and who was in conversation with who and who was talking back to who. And so I'm from the CUNY Graduate Center, so I was educated in the sight of Audre Lorde and June Jordan and all of these folks who were being educators in this CUNY system. And I always felt like it was a special place. But every time I find out one more link to the CUNY system, I'm like, see, I see why it looks like this because, they agitated for it. They did this work. They made these interventions, even in the work that was foundational. So the title of my book, We Are Pregnant with Freedom, comes from a poem by Assata Shakur in her political autobiography. And so Asada ends this poem, we are pregnant with freedom, we are a conspiracy. And it stopped me in my tracks. But Asada was also educated in the CUNY system.
Yeah.
Um, right? And she describes her time as being a student. And she has this line too that I love and that I often kind of also tell my students is that theory without practice is just as incomplete as practice without theory, and that we need both in
Mhm.
order to enact this kind of vision of the world that we want. And so I always tell my students it's one thing to learn the theory, but how does it look in practice? What does it mean to take this forward? And so I feel like in so many ways I'm kind of, just fascinated with how many people came out of that system and in the foundations of the thinking of Black studies in that space.
Well, I think that that is one, like you said, there's a lot of people that came out or taught in and touched that space. There's a
Mhm.
lot of um so much of the foundational understanding of Black studies coming from the CUNY system, which is really interesting to think about. In that time period, in that city, like,
Yes,
there's so much that was happening.
so much.
Um, and it's almost like every time somebody talks about, like, the early years of the field of Black studies in, like, New York. It's like,
Mhm.
I can't imagine what it would have been like to be there with all of these
Oh
thinkers
my
all at
goodness.
once, and, like, the standard that they were setting, like, just to try to even be in conversation, there was so much you had to do, like,
Yeah,
I can't imagine.
yeah, and, it's so interesting because I feel like those imprints still would show up. Like, I when I was deciding where to go to graduate school, I was like, "I just feel like this is just a magical combination of the things I wanna do."
Mhm,
And I couldn't quite put my finger on what was making me feel that way, but I think that energy, that brilliance, and the ways that it created legacies even when we didn't think those legacies we didn't have tangible, records of them, that they were doing such important work that was shaping these fields, I think about, Octavia Butler's beautiful, reflection, all that you touch you change, all that you change changes you, right? Everything they touched, it impacted those spaces. It impacted the way students showed up and continue to show up in those spaces. And
mhm.
just that vibrance and the things that I was able to kind of even experience from it. I couldn't imagine what it would have been like to have done it in real time. Oh my gosh, to be a student, right, in June Jordan's classroom or Audre Lorde's classroom, like, I just think about that as just it had to be magical.
Yeah,
Had to be
yeah,
magical. Mhm.
sure.
Yes.
So, what interests and excites you most about the future of Black studies?
Oh my god, so much excites me about the future of Black studies. So first of all, one of the things I think about what's happening in our world because Black studies has always been in conversation with the now, right? And the future. And I think about the ways that some of the contributions or the things that, Black people have done in the world continue to be in contestation, if you will. And what I love about Black studies is that in spite of all of that, it keeps going. It keeps going. That this work is here to stay and that it is something that we are in many ways just continuing to see as at the forefront of academia. You know, I look at the places and the ways that academia is moving and Black studies is forging those new directions. And that is something that cannot be denied. And so, what excites me about the future is seeing what's next. Where are we going to take this work, and how are we going to continue to produce scholarship that shifts the way people understand and think? One of the elements of the book I just completed, I have a chapter on imagination, right? and imagination as a site of resistance. So, people like Ruha Benjamin most recently, as well as Miriam Kaba, Adrienne Marie Brown, so many thinkers, Robin D.G. Kelly, right, with Freedom Dreams. Those texts are giving us, in many ways, a roadmap to using all the imaginative possibilities that we have access to, way to build paths to freedom. And that I'm very interested in seeing how scholars continue to advance that work and how people in the world use and build off of this kind of critical work of imagining all of these possibilities as we move toward the world we want to see and the world that we deserve. And that work is happening in Black studies, right? So that makes me really excited.
Thank you. I think that so I've had several conversations recently where like elements of refusal or resistance are talked about, or survival are talked about.
Yeah,
I think imagination is such an important component of that. You have to envision life being different than it is now,
that's
um,
it.
or else you're not going to be able to create those things. Before you can create it, you've got to dream it. So I
Yeah.
think that is
Mhm,
such an important point and reminder,
mhm.
in this moment, but in all of the moments and in the field of Black studies, because that's what it's done. It's
Yeah,
always imagined something else.
yeah, yeah. Always imagine something else and build things out of impossibilities. Right? So I'm always saying, we've been here before. We know what this looks like. What we have to do and what our charge is to do is to learn those lessons and apply them to our present and continue to fight for the future we deserve. Because that is what Black Studies has given us. They've given us an incredible set of, roadmaps, different types of possibilities, different ways of thinking about the world. And so, as we harness all that knowledge, I think the beauty of that is that we then have the opportunity to put ourselves in conversation and to continue to create and to think together and to work toward, this possibility of freedom. And I think it's so critical now because it's so easy to kind of give in to despair. And so that's one of the things, that I've continued to tell my students and myself as well is to not let that be the story, not let that be the narrative, that we kind of resigned ourselves to this reality.
Well, I think that is a wonderful place for me to stop asking questions. But is there anything else you'd like to share or talk about?
Well, I just want to say thank you so much for this platform and for this space. I think as we continue to document the work, you all are doing such an amazing job of bringing together different voices and offering a real, sense of the impact of the field and where it's going. And so I'm just really incredibly honored and happy to be a part of that.
Well, thank you so much for that, and thank you so much for being here. This has been an amazing and rewarding journey, and being able to talk with so many phenomenal practitioners of Black studies across,
Mhm.
genres in and out of academia. It has been surprising.
Mm,
As in doing it, it's been surprising, right? Like, the different perspectives and voices and work that's happening, and
mhm.
I just think it's really great to be able to have those varying perspectives and draw on them all, and I always learn so, so much from every
Yeah.
conversation. I feel like I'm back in grad school, like, I take notes and I'm like Let me go read this and that.
Right? And then somebody drops a book, you like, "Let me go read that. Let me go listen to this." Yes, yes. That's how I've been experiencing too, like, listening and hearing, all the brilliance that is coming out of this podcast.
Thank you so much for adding to that and for the work that you are doing. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.